The wind howled across the barren plains, carrying with it the dust of broken pride and forgotten promises. Under the fading light of the western sun, a rancher stood alone, his calloused hands trembling not from fear of the wild, but from the sting of betrayal. His own sons, those he had fed, clothed, and raised with the sweat of his brow, had spat on him as if he were no more than the dirt beneath their boots. The weight of shame pressed heavier than any saddle he had ever borne, and in that silence, the land itself seemed to judge him. The ranch had once been a place of strength, its fences sturdy, its cattle grazing in peace. But time had hardened his children's hearts, blinding them to the sacrifices that had kept their bellies full and their future secure. Instead of gratitude, they gave him contempt. Neighbors whispered that the old man's days were numbered, that he would wither under the cruelty of his own blood. Each insult echoed louder than gunfire, each rejection a wound deeper than any knife could cut. And yet, as the night stretched its cloak over the prairie, something stirred beyond the horizon. A presence feared and revered alike, a rider whose very name carried the weight of legends. The Comanche, giants of the saddle, spirits of the wind, rode for no one without cause. But whispers began to rise, carried from campfire to campfire, that one among them, towering and unyielding, had set his course toward the struggling rancher. No one understood why, but everyone knew this. When the Comanche rode, the world shifted. The old man did not ask for rescue. Pride still burned in his chest, though dimmed by sorrow. Yet fate has a way of sending its fiercest storms not to destroy, but to reveal hidden truths. And so, when hoofbeats thundered across the plain, hearts trembled, for they knew that the story of this rancher was about to be rewritten by the hand of destiny itself. This was not just the tale of a father cast aside by his sons. It was the beginning of something greater, a test of loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bond between man and the untamed spirit of the West. The question lingered like smoke in the cold night air. Why would a giant Comanche, feared by many, ride for a man scorned by his own family? The answer would shake the prairie to its very core. The morning after his humiliation, the rancher rose before dawn. His body ached from years of toil, but his heart carried a heavier burden, the bitter memory of his son's contempt. The land around him was silent, save for the whisper of the wind through the tall grass. Each creak of the barn, each lowing of the cattle seemed to remind him of the decades he had spent fighting drought, storms, and bandits to keep this place alive. And now, it was his own bloodline that had turned against him. He walked across the corral, dragging his boots through the dust, every step echoing the weight of loneliness. The cattle were thinning, his fences sagging, his ranch crumbling under the same neglect his sons accused him of. They had demanded he sell the land, abandon the legacy of their forefathers, and chase profit instead of pride. When he refused, they spat, not only on him but on everything the ranch represented. His silence was not weakness, but a shield, hiding the storm that brewed within. By midday, rumors began to spread across the frontier towns. Travelers spoke of a giant Comanche riding with purpose, his horse black as midnight, his presence commanding awe. Some feared he rode for war, others swore it was vengeance. Yet no one dared cross his path, for the Comanche were not men easily swayed by gold or power. They rode for honor, and for reasons buried deep within the heart of the plains. The rancher, though broken in spirit, felt a strange stirring when he heard the whispers. Could it be true? Could the Comanche be coming to his ranch? The thought unsettled him. He had fought against their raids in his youth, raised his rifle when their shadows darkened the horizon. And now, the same people he once feared might be the only ones willing to stand for him. Fate has a cruel way of binding enemies together, stitching the torn fabric of history with threads of necessity. As the sun dipped low, painting the horizon with fire, the rancher sat alone by the fence post. He traced the grain of the weathered wood with his calloused hands, his mind drifting between shame and hope. Somewhere beyond the hills, the sound of distant hoofbeats echoed like thunder in his chest. Whether it was salvation or doom, he could not yet know. But he understood one truth. The land listens, and it answers in its own time. Night fell heavy, with stars scattered across the sky like shards of broken glass. The rancher's sons had left him to his solitude, laughing in saloons and boasting of the empire they would build once the old man was gone. They believed the ranch was dying, that its worth lay only in what could be sold to the highest bidder. Yet in the shadows of the prairie, another story was taking shape, one none of them could foresee. The Comanche rode silently, his silhouette tall against the moonlit plains. His horse's hooves struck the earth with a rhythm that seemed older than time itself. Legend spoke of him as a warrior of immense strength, a man who had faced countless battles and emerged with scars that told stories more powerful than words. Children in nearby camps whispered his name with reverence, while grown men lowered their voices when speaking of him. To cross paths with such a man was to stand before the spirit of the frontier itself. At dawn, the rancher awoke to find tracks leading across his land. Hoofprints pressed deep into the soil, as though the very earth bowed beneath the weight of the rider. His heart quickened. He followed the trail, each step stirring old memories of fear and conflict. He remembered nights of defending his herd from raids, the cries of war echoing through the canyon. And yet, something about these tracks felt different. There was no chaos, no destruction, only purpose. By mid-morning, he spotted the figure in the distance. Towering on horseback, the Comanche seemed carved from stone, his gaze fixed, unyielding. The rancher's breath caught in his throat. For the first time in years, he felt small, not because of his son's rejection, but because destiny itself had ridden onto his land. The air grew heavy with silence as the two men locked eyes across the pasture. One carried the burden of betrayal, the other the weight of forgotten alliances. The rancher's hands trembled as he gripped the worn wood of the fence. He did not know whether to reach for his rifle or bow his head in respect. But deep within, a realization struck him like lightning. Sometimes, the allies we least expect are the ones who arrive when all hope has vanished. And in that stillness, with the rising sun casting long shadows over the prairie, the story of the rancher and the Comanche truly began. The rancher's voice cracked as he finally broke the silence. "What business brings you here?" His words were cautious, neither welcoming nor hostile, but heavy with the uncertainty of a man who had spent his life watching the line between friend and foe blur under the sun of the west. The Comanche did not answer at once. He dismounted slowly, towering above the ground as though even the earth struggled to carry his weight. His presence was a storm contained in flesh, and yet his eyes carried a stillness that unsettled the rancher more than any weapon could. The giant Comanche's gaze traveled over the ranch, the broken fences, the weary cattle, the abandoned tools scattered across the yard. He saw not just the decay of a homestead, but the echo of years of labor etched into every board and nail. Finally, he spoke, his voice deep and measured. "A man who bleeds for the land should not be spat on by his own blood." The rancher flinched, for those words cut deeper than his son's betrayal. It was as if this stranger could see into the very marrow of his soul. The rancher's pride rebelled. He straightened his back, lifting his chin though the weight of shame still pressed against him. "My sons are young. They know nothing of the land," he muttered. But even as he spoke, the hollowness of the excuse rang in his ears. The Comanche's eyes narrowed, as if judging not the words, but the weakness behind them. The silence that followed carried more power than any insult, forcing the rancher to face the truth he had long tried to bury. The old man finally lowered his eyes, not in surrender, but in weary acknowledgement. "I fought your people once," he confessed, his voice raw. "I raised my rifle against you. And now you stand here, when even my own blood would rather see me crawl." It was a statement of confusion more than defiance, an unspoken question that begged for meaning. Why him? Why now? Why would the feared Comanche come to a rancher stripped of dignity and strength? The warrior did not flinch. He only said, "The land remembers, and the land calls me here." His words were not an explanation, but a riddle wrapped in the voice of the plains. The rancher felt a chill run through him, for he realized this encounter was not chance. It was destiny, riding on the hooves of a black horse. Word spread like wildfire through the frontier. By evening, ranch hands, drifters, and even townsfolk whispered of the strange alliance forming on that lonely patch of land. The sons laughed when they heard, calling their father desperate, clinging to superstition and shadows. Yet others, hardened men who had seen the Comanche's wrath in battle, did not laugh. They knew the presence of such a warrior meant more than coincidence. It meant something was stirring in the heart of the West. Meanwhile, the rancher and the Comanche stood side by side at the corral, the silence between them carrying more weight than words. The rancher stole glances at the warrior, studying the scars that lined his arms and the calm power in his posture. This was no ordinary man. He bore the mark of one who had seen death and defied it, of one who had walked through storms and returned unbroken. And though he was a stranger, the rancher felt a strange spark of hope in his presence, as if the land itself had sent him as a shield against despair. The Comanche bent down, scooping a handful of soil into his palm. He let it slip slowly through his fingers, watching it scatter in the wind. "This land is sick," he said. "It will die if no man stands for it." His words cut through the rancher's heart, for they mirrored the truth he had long denied. The ranch was more than a piece of property. It was his lifeblood, the last remnant of his forefathers, and abandoning it would mean letting his son's betrayal define his final days. That night, they sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows across their weathered faces. The rancher spoke of his struggles, of the droughts, the raids, the endless toil. The Comanche listened, his silence heavy, his eyes never leaving the flames. When the rancher finished, there was no pity in the warrior's gaze, only resolve. "You're not done," he said simply, and in those 3 words, the rancher felt the spark of something long buried, strength. Yet outside the glow of the fire, the prairie whispered of storms to come. The rancher's sons, blinded by greed and poisoned by pride, would not stand idle. They were plotting, their laughter carrying into the night, unaware that destiny had chosen to weave their story into something greater than they could imagine. For when blood betrays, the plains themselves often rise to bear witness. The next morning dawned with a restless wind sweeping across the plains. The rancher rose with the first light, his body still weary, but his spirit strangely steady. For the first time in years, he did not feel entirely alone. As he stepped outside, he found the Comanche already awake, standing tall near the corral with his horse beside him, as if he had been watching over the ranch through the night. There was a quiet reassurance in that sight, an unspoken vow that the land, though battered, was not yet defeated. The rancher's sons returned at midday, their boots kicking up dust as they rode in with smug grins. They laughed when they saw the Comanche, mocking their father for keeping company with what they called a savage. The rancher's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. It was the Comanche who stepped forward, his presence alone silencing the air. The sons sneered, but behind their bravado was a flicker of unease. They had heard stories of the giant warrior, of his unbroken spirit, of enemies who had fallen before him. And though they mocked with their tongues, their eyes betrayed fear. The eldest son spat at his father's feet once more. "You would rather stand with him than with your own blood?" he jeered. The rancher's chest tightened with shame, but before he could speak, the Comanche's voice thundered like distant storm clouds. "Blood is not always bound by honor. A man who spits on his father spits also on the earth that raised him." The words rang across the yard like a judgment, heavy and inescapable. The sons recoiled, unaccustomed to being spoken to with such raw truth. Their pride, however, would not bend. They left in anger, swearing their father's time had passed, promising to return and claim the land as their own. The rancher stood frozen as they rode away, torn between sorrow and rage. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of knowing his sons were no longer merely ungrateful. They had become enemies to everything he had built. He looked to the Comanche, searching for strength, and found in his eyes a fire that told him he was not yet beaten. That night, the rancher lay awake, staring at the wooden beams above his bed. His sons had chosen their path, and now so must he. The hoofbeats of betrayal still echoed in his mind, but beneath them, another rhythm had begun to stir. The steady, unyielding beat of destiny, carried on the back of a giant Comanche who had chosen, for reasons yet unknown, to stand at his side. The days that followed were filled with silence, but not the silence of despair. It was the silence of preparation, of 2 men bound by the weight of the land itself. The Comanche worked alongside the rancher, mending fences, tending cattle, sharpening the tools that had grown dull with neglect. His hands, though marked by war, moved with a surprising gentleness when he cared for the animals, as though he understood that strength meant nothing without stewardship. The rancher watched in quiet awe. Here was a man who owed him nothing, no blood, no loyalty, yet he labored as if the ranch were his own. Each swing of the hammer, each knot tied in the rope, rekindled in the rancher a fire he thought had long since burned out. His back ached, his hands bled anew, but for the first time in years, he felt alive. He was no longer a man abandoned by his sons. He was a man reclaiming his place in the world. Yet whispers reached him from town. His sons were gathering men, men greedy for land and blind to honor. They spoke of taking the ranch by force, of driving their father into the dust once and for all. The rancher's heart sank, but the Comanche only nodded when he heard the news. "Let them come," he said calmly, his voice steady as stone. "The land will decide who belongs." That night, by the crackling fire, the rancher found the courage to ask the question that had haunted him since the warrior's arrival. "Why me? Why stand with a man who once raised his rifle against your people?" The Comanche looked into the flames, his face carved by shadows and light. "Because the land remembers truth, and truth is not found in the mouths of sons who spit on their father. It is found in the sweat of men who bleed for what is theirs." His words fell heavy, like an oath spoken by the earth itself. The rancher felt his throat tighten. He realized then that this was no simple alliance. It was a covenant, forged not by blood or history, but by the land itself. A bond between two men who carried wounds too deep for words, yet found in each other the reflection of endurance. As the flames flickered, the rancher knew that the coming storm would not break him. For when the Comanche rode at his side, the plains themselves seemed to rise in defiance. The sun rose red the next morning, painting the sky as if warning of blood to come. The rancher stepped out into the crisp air and felt a heaviness pressing against his chest. He had seen storms before, floods, droughts, raids, but nothing compared to the storm that now approached in the shape of his own flesh and blood. His sons were not boys anymore. They were men with hardened hearts, sharpened not by struggle, but by greed. And men like that could not be reasoned with. Across the yard, the Comanche mounted his black horse, his frame towering like a sentinel of the plains. The rancher watched him, torn between awe and unease. The warrior's silence was louder than any promise, his mere presence enough to make even the bravest hesitate. There was no fear in his eyes, only certainty, as though he had already faced the battle and returned from it unbroken. It gave the rancher a strange comfort, though his own heart still wavered. By midday, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the prairie. A group of riders appeared on the horizon, led by the rancher's sons. They came not as kin, but as conquerors, their voices rising in cruel laughter, their rifles slung across their saddles. The rancher's breath caught as he saw the contempt etched across their faces. These were not the boys he had raised. These were men consumed by pride, blinded by the glitter of land and power. The rancher's eldest son called out, his voice dripping with venom. "Step aside, old man. This land is wasted on you. Sell it, leave it, or we'll take it with our own hands." The rancher's knees trembled, but he stood his ground, gripping the worn fence post, as if it anchored him to his very soul. Before he could reply, the Comanche's voice boomed across the field like thunder. "This land belongs to those who honor it. You spit on your father. You spit on the earth. And the earth does not forget." The younger sons scoffed, mocking the warrior, but their laughter rang hollow. The sight of the giant Comanche unnerved them, though pride forced them to hide it behind cruel smirks. The rancher's heart pounded. He knew the moment of reckoning had come. Blood or bond, one would break before the day was done. The standoff stretched into silence, the wind carrying only the creak of saddle leather and the restless stamping of hoofs. The rancher felt the weight of his years pressing against him. Yet in the stillness, he sensed something shift. The Comanche did not flinch, did not waver. His presence was a wall of stone against the storm. And in that strength, the rancher felt his spine straighten, his voice rise from depths long thought buried. He stepped forward, facing his sons with fire in his eyes. "I gave you this land. he said, his words sharp as steel. "I bled for it, starved for it, fought for it, and you repay me with spit. You may carry my blood, but you carry none of my honor." The words struck like a whip, and for a fleeting moment, the sons faltered. They had expected weakness, not defiance. The eldest sneered, masking his hesitation with anger. He raised his rifle, pointing it toward his father. But before he could take aim, the Comanche's horse moved forward, each step deliberate, echoing like war drums across the earth. The warrior's gaze locked on the young man, and the air itself seemed to grow heavier. "Raise that weapon," the Comanche warned, "and you raise it not only against your father, but against the land that bore you, and the land will judge you." The rancher's breath caught. For the first time, his sons seemed shaken, their arrogance cracking under the weight of words spoken with the authority of the plains. Yet pride still burned within them, twisting their faces into scowls. The eldest spat once more, but his spit fell short of its mark, landing in the dust between them. It was not defiance. It was hesitation disguised as rage. The rancher stood taller then, his chest rising, his shame lifting like smoke from fire. For the first time in years, he felt the power of a man unbroken, a man whose worth was not determined by sons blinded by greed. And as he looked to the Comanche, he knew the truth. This was no longer about land or inheritance. It was about honor, and honor would not yield. The rancher's heart pounded as the silence deepened, a silence so sharp it felt like the very earth was holding its breath. His sons shifted uneasily in their saddles, their eyes darting between their father and the towering Comanche. The eldest, desperate to mask his faltering resolve, barked an order for the others to dismount. Yet even as they slid from their horses, their boots striking the ground, the weight of the Comanche's presence loomed over them like a mountain. The rancher stepped forward, closing the space between himself and his sons. His voice, cracked with age yet firm with conviction, carried across the yard. "You believe this land is yours to take," he said, "but the land chooses its stewards. It is not bought with coin, nor claimed with spit. It is earned with sweat, sacrifice, and the kind of love only a man bound to it can understand." His words struck like hammer blows, and for a moment, his sons wavered, caught between pride and the truth they could not deny. The Comanche advanced as well, his steps slow, deliberate, his eyes fixed on the men who had betrayed their own blood. He raised a hand, not in threat, but in warning. "The West remembers," he said, his voice resonant, carrying the weight of centuries. "Men who honor nothing will find nothing but dust. You see yourselves as conquerors, but you are children, blind to the earth beneath your feet." His words settled into the silence like stones sinking into a river, impossible to ignore. The youngest son, trembling, lowered his gaze. For the first time, shame flickered across his face. He muttered something too faint for the others to hear, but the rancher's heart caught the shift, one seed of doubt planted in soil hardened by arrogance. Yet the eldest would not bend. His pride, sharper than any blade, drove him forward. He spat once more, not at his father this time, but at the ground where the Comanche stood. The warrior's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. The rancher felt the air grow heavy, as though the plains themselves bristled at the insult. Something inevitable had begun, a clash not merely between father and sons, but between honor and greed, truth and betrayal. The rancher gripped the fence with trembling hands, knowing the final test was upon them. The eldest son raised his rifle again, his voice breaking through the tension. "If the land belongs to anyone, it belongs to those strong enough to take it." His words cut the air, but they were met not with fear, only silence. The Comanche did not move. He stood as still as stone, his gaze piercing, unyielding. The rancher's breath caught in his chest, every second stretching like an eternity. Then, with a suddenness that struck like lightning, the Comanche moved. His hand darted forward, not for his weapon, but for the rifle itself. In one swift motion, he tore it from the son's grip and cast it to the ground. The crack of wood and metal against dirt echoed like a gunshot, silencing the air. The sons froze, their arrogance stripped bare, their bravado crumbling beneath the weight of a power they could not match. The rancher's eyes filled, not with fear, but with something far deeper: vindication. For years, he had carried the shame of being dismissed, spat upon, forgotten. Now, before his very eyes, the truth stood undeniable. Strength was not in greed or mockery, but in the endurance of men who bled for what was rightfully theirs. His voice rose, steady and strong. "You may be my sons, but you are no heirs. The land will not honor you, because you have not honored it." The youngest, shaken, stepped back, his hands trembling. He looked at his father with eyes no longer filled with contempt but confusion, perhaps even regret. The middle son followed, his bravado faltering, his gaze dropping to the ground. Only the eldest remained, his pride a poison too strong to release. Yet even he could not hide the flicker of fear that passed across his face as the Comanche towered above him, unyielding as the plains themselves. The wind howled through the ranch, carrying dust and silence in equal measure. The battle had not been fought with bullets or blood, but with honor, with truth, with the weight of destiny itself. The rancher stood taller than he had in years, his shame washed away by the storm of the West. Beside him, the Comanche remained, not as an enemy, not even as an ally, but as something far greater, a guardian sent by the land to remind men that honor, once lost, can never be bought back. The dust settled over the ranch, and with it came a silence that felt heavier than any gunshot. The rancher stood in the fading light, no longer the broken man spat upon by his sons, but a figure reclaimed by honor and truth. The Comanche at his side was not just a warrior. He was the embodiment of the land itself, a reminder that destiny often rises when all hope seems lost. The betrayal of blood had been met with the strength of spirit, and the ranch endured, not through wealth or power, but through the unyielding courage of those who refused to bow. In that moment, the rancher understood a lesson written not in words but in scars. Blood may tie men together, but it is honor that defines them. His sons had chosen the path of greed, and in doing so, had severed themselves from the very legacy they sought to claim. Yet through their rejection, the rancher discovered something greater. That family is not only who shares your name, but who stands with you when the world turns away. That truth was carved into the soil of the plains, eternal as the horizon. The image of the giant Comanche, riding for him, would remain etched in memory forever. It was a story that spoke of more than survival. It spoke of redemption, of the unexpected bonds that shape our lives when pride and arrogance crumble. For the rancher, the arrival of the warrior was no accident. It was the land's way of declaring that no man who bleeds in silence is ever truly forgotten. The West has always honored endurance, and this day was no different. As the night sky stretched above them, scattered with stars, the rancher felt no fear of what lay ahead. He had stood against betrayal and risen taller than his years. His sons might return, their hearts hardened still, but they could not erase what had been revealed. That true strength is not found in cruelty or conquest, but in loyalty, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond between man and the earth he calls his own. The land had spoken, and its voice could not be silenced. And now, it is your turn to carry this reflection forward. If this story moved you, if it stirred something deep within, let your voice be heard. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let others know what honor means to you. And keep this conversation alive. Subscribe to the channel so that more tales like this one, stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the strength within, may find their way to you. And if this tale struck your heart, show your support with a like, so together we can keep the spirit of the Old West burning bright.